these brain asymmetries are influencing our everyday lives pretty much every second of our existence.
Why are people right or left-handed?
Why somebody's left or right-handed has all to do with the organization of their brain. So handedness, while named for the hands, has nothing to do with the hands. The brain has two halves, left and right half, and the left half is controlling the right half of the body, so also the right arm, and the right half of the brain is controlling the left part of the body, so also the left hand. And we know that these two parts of the brain, they're not completely identical. So they often have different tasks, and we call that brain dominance or hemispheric asymmetries. And handedness is one of these hemispheric asymmetries. For a left-handed person, the right motor cortex, the right motor part of the brain, is dominant for fine motor movements like writing a love letter or drawing a doodle or whatever. And for a right-handed person, that is reversed. So why somebody's left or right-handed is because they have different brain dominances for hand movements.
Why would there be a brain dominance difference in people?
That has to do a lot with efficiency. So the brain is a very energy-hungry organ. So if you look at how much of the calories that the body or a person takes in every day is used to keep the brain thinking, it's about 20%. And the brain itself has a mass less than a kilo, so it's a pretty small organ compared to the rest of the body, but it's very energy hungry. And by dividing tasks into one hemisphere, not unnecessarily doubling them and have them performed by both hemispheres, what the body essentially does is to conserve energy.
So I'm going to try to take this as far as I possibly can, right? So I'm left-handed. If there is something different in my brain that makes me left-handed, are people who are left-handed fundamentally different than people who are right-handed? Like if there's a difference in the brain, is it different throughout the entire body? Or is this, no, you just use your left hand?
Just as people have different bodies, people have different brains. And there is not such a thing as sort of like it's a better or worse in terms of brain organization of left or right-handers. It's just basically flipped, right? If you're a left-hander, your dominant side is the other side than mine. I'm a right-hander. But it doesn't make you in any way inherently better or worse organized. We just understand this as sort of like a normal continuum of how brains can be organized, but it has no like deeper impact on a lot of other things, except that it is sometimes related to other forms of asymmetry. So we know, for example, language, the ability to speak, this is very asymmetrically organized, and about 95% of right-handers, but only 75% of left-handers, language is represented in the left hemisphere. You don't necessarily see this in everyday life a lot, but people always notice this if they have a family member who suffered a stroke. Because if people have a stroke, and the stroke affects the left side of the brain, so for example, like the left major artery is clogged, then the patients always have strong difficulties in speaking. While if somebody has a stroke that affects only the right side of the brain, most of the time people don't have problems speaking, but sometimes if they're left-handed, they have.
So being right or left-handed doesn't kind of set the brain up in a whole different way.
No. So this is what people thought, like maybe in the 70s or 80s. But newer research pretty much shows that what it does is it affects our motor abilities. But all these ideas that people had like 20, 30 years ago, that, for example, like left-handers are more creative. There's a very recent, very interesting study on that. And that basically shows both left and right-handers are very convinced that left-handers are more creative. Left-handers also very significantly choose certain jobs where they think creativity is something that is important for the job. But if you actually measure artistic ability or creative thinking or creative ability, what the results show in big meter studies is pretty much left-handers can be great creative artists. Left-handers can also be not creative at all. And the same goes for right-handers. No? So the objectively measured ability, if you go away from these like very small studies people did like in the 70s or 80s, and you really go to massive numbers of people, shows there's no difference in like creativity in the brain between left and right-handers. There's just a very big difference in the belief about that left-handers are more creative than right-handers. And similar things have also been found for intelligence. So people thought left-handers might be more intelligent. Other people thought they are less intelligent. Then there was the idea there's more fluctuation in intelligence. What do the largest studies show? There is no difference. That is, a lot of things are sort of societal beliefs that are not really backed up by the science, the large scale science we do today. When we find differences in sort of like performances or abilities between left and right-handedness, these have often to do with like situational demands and surprise, like all these sports findings. But this is not that left-handers are inherently better boxers or tennis players or pitchers. It is just in a system in which people train mostly facing right-handed opponents. They have this element of rarity, which makes them harder to handle because the opponents didn't train for that situation as well typically and don't encounter it as much.
So when is our handedness decided? Is this moment of conception, like as soon as we are formed individuals, the decision is made? Or is it like 6 months in, 2 years in? Like when is our handedness kind of established?
It's quite interesting. It is established much earlier than most people would think. It is established long before birth. So there is a series of experiments on that where people would use very advanced ultrasound techniques. So you know the typical ultrasound pictures like pretty much every parent gets of their kids. And they're like similar pictures, but much more detailed. And what you could show by using these ultrasound techniques is that if you do this repeatedly, that fetuses in the womb have a preferred site to interact with their arm or to touch their face and things like that. So they show these motor symmetries. It's of course not handedness in the sense of writing, but they show motor symmetries very early on.
What would happen then if somebody who was supposed to be right-handed was forced to be left-handed or vice versa? Do we lose something if we lose our natural handedness?
Yes, you do. If you train any ability, you train a sport, what happens in the brain is neuroplasticity, right? So your brain can adapt. You learn a new language, your brain changes. You learn how to play the piano, your brain changes. You learn how to play baseball, your brain changes. But it isn't your whole brain that changes. It is mostly those areas that get direct feedback from what you're doing, right? So if you write with your non-dominant hand, you use your so-called primary motor cortex, so the part of the brain, of the motor part of the brain, that is directly controlling the hands. And we know from neuroimaging studies that it is pretty much possible to relearn these parts of the brain to the other hand. The problem is that the control of our like writing or whatever we're doing with our hands is also influenced by other brain areas. That's called the supplementary motor cortex. And you cannot train this brain area as well as these directly involved brain areas. So what happens is that a lot of these people who are relearning their handedness, be it forced or like voluntarily, they report that, for example, writing is much more difficult, much harder for them than with the dominant hands. They report they have like more cramps, they have like often lose interest in writing and find it very like much harder than they used to find it with the dominant hands. And the idea is that you basically only partially learn to write with the other hand. So the movement itself you learn, but the planning aspects you don't. And then your head gets a little bit confused because then on one side of the brain, the movements are planned, and on the other side of the brain, you're executing the movements. But then these brain areas are not next to each other anymore, but they always have to go over the connections between the two hemispheres. So you take longer, it gets more complicated to conduct this movement.
You can do it, but you'll never be the same.
And if you look at the clinical research, you also typically find that people find it emotionally challenging. So they tend not to enjoy the relearning process and find it very difficult and hard.
So for me, I'm left-handed sitting down, right left-handed, brush my teeth left-handed. But if I'm standing up, I'm right-handed. Like sports, I throw a ball right-handed, I shoot a basketball right-handed. Why would that be? Like, why would there be the differences in those for some people like that? Like, why would somebody be one hand this way and one hand that way?
Handedness is sort of a continuum, right? So people used to measure handedness by just asking for writing hand. But these days what we do is we try to get a larger spectrum of behaviors people do with their hand. And what you typically find, what's quite interesting, is that most right-handed people, they use their right hand for pretty much everything. So they're really like 100% right-handed for every single behavior and very rarely do anything with the left hand. Left-handers, on the other side, typically show the pattern that you're describing. There are very few left-handers that are actually using the left hand for absolutely everything, but it's more common that they use the left hand for the majority of activities and especially for writing. For most people, the writing is what defines them as a left-hander. But it's not uncommon that a left-hander would, for example, like throw a baseball or open something with the right hand also. And the question about why this happens has, I think, at some point to do with the environment. So can you remember, like, who taught you how to throw a baseball?
Oh, probably my father, who was right-handed.
Yeah, your dad, when he was right-handed. So what typically happens is, since there are more people who are right-handed, a lot of left-handed kids then have right-handed parents, and they teach them these behaviors like throwing. They are not fine motor behaviors, but they're just like much more easier to do with the non-dominant hand, right? So for example, if you think about writing with the right hand, that's probably harder than throwing a baseball with the right hand. So these are obviously much easier to learn with the non-dominant hand. And if you now think you spend a lot of fun times with your dad throwing baseballs and you just wanted to do it like he did, and you basically did what we call imitation learning, then your learning history, because you learned it from right-handed person, might have influenced your preference here.
But then would that mean that, like, if I can throw a football 30 yards with my right hand, whatever, and I'm a natural left-hander, if I had just done it with my left hand, would I be able to throw it 32 yards or whatever? Like, would I be, if that hadn't have been taught to me, did I lose something in that process?
Yeah, you might. For example, if you use something like force measurement on dominant and non-dominant hands, people typically find that people are stronger and can generate more force with the dominant hand.
Are you ready for some harder / listener submitted questions?
I can try my best.
Are there patterns to handedness? Like, are there certain populations, whether that be age ranges, geographic locations, ethnicities, that tend to be more left-handed or more right-handed than other populations?
Men are more likely to be left-handed than women, by about 1%. Um, and this is probably something where male sex hormones like testosterone play a role for handedness. The other pattern we see if you do like large worldwide integration is that there is a age pattern, but I don't think it's actually an age pattern in the terms that like older people are less likely to be left-handed. This is just reflecting that these practices of relearning children have been abandoned by most countries at sort of like the 70s, right? So I'm not sure about the States, but in Germany, I think they stopped doing it in around 71. So older people are more likely to show up as right-handed in bigger studies because there have been more old people who have been retrained from left-handedness to right-handedness. There's also the opposite thing that in some countries, mostly in Scandinavia, where the relearning was never practiced as much and was always been very positive towards left-handedness, there tend to be a few more left-handers. So this goes up to like 15 something percent, or about the worldwide average of 10.6%. But we also know there's no country in the world where left-handedness goes above 20%. So it's always a minority, no matter where you're looking.
Why was the right hand the dominant one? Why has it always been dominant?
That's hard to say. I think it might just be like a random process that at some point one thing became the more common one in the population and the other point the more rare one, and then this rarity, this frequency dependent selection basically took over, because we know that is pretty unique for humans, right? So we know in humans it's 10.6% left-handedness, but for example if you look at cats, there was almost equal numbers. So it is not like that in all animals it is always like a huge dominance for the left hand, for the right hand. It is something that seems to be typically human.
Does handedness extend to footedness? Like if you're left-handed, are you left-footed?
To some extent, but not 100%. Yes, there is a significant association, so most right-handers are also right-footed, but it's not going up to 100%. So there is also a couple of right-handed people that are left-footed.
Why do we have two hemispheres? Like, why not just have one big brain? I mean, we have one big brain. You know what I mean? Like, why is there why split it in half? What seems to be the reason for that?
The reason for that is obviously we're a bilateral organism, right? So we have two arms and two legs, and we are moving around in a three-dimensional world. So what would happen if you have one big brain and that would send like one motor signal out? Both of your feet would move forward at the same time and you would fall over and hurt your head, right? So the idea to have two isolated motor activators basically in the two hemispheres, I think is that these two.
What's the most interesting thing about handedness to you?
That you can basically learn a lot about how the brain of somebody is organized just by looking at what they're doing. So people they think with their brain, but they don't think a lot about their brain. And by looking at all these like tiny asymmetries and tiny quirks and habits of people in their everyday life, you learn a lot about them without them actually realizing that. And this is something that is important for our behavior and our feelings on a lot more levels than people actually think. So for example, if you remember last time you kissed somebody, Have you ever consciously thought about that you have a very strong asymmetry in your preference on how to turn your head when kissing? So most right-handed people turn their head to the right when kissing, and they find it very, very weird to turn it to the other side. And there's lots of other things like that, right? So if you hug somebody, you hug that person almost always with the same arm leading into the hug. People have a favorite side on to chew their food on, right, of their mouth. So you don't like chew all the food in the center. You have one side where you like to chew your food on better because it makes you feel better emotionally, and so on and so on. So if you really start looking for it, or eye blinking, things like that, how you tilt your head, if you're really looking into that, these brain asymmetries are influencing our everyday lives pretty much every second of our existence. And most people never actually like consciously think about how their brain organization is shaping their lives. I find it very interesting to understand these things because it tells you a lot about how these very old mechanisms of how nervous systems are organized and regulate are still very much relevant for us in 2025.
Yeah, now that I think about like anything that I do, I always do it with a certain side. If I reach for a door, I reach for it with a certain side. When I give somebody a hug, I do it with a certain side. I think that's the interesting thing for me personally is that like because there's that left hand, right hand, I always have to figure out which way I'm going to do something. Like if I play a new sport, like if I go bowling, like, okay, am I bowling with my left hand? Or am I bowling with my right hand? And I kind of have to figure it out a little bit.
Pretty much everything that can be like done to one side, people do to one side. For example, also social media. It's very interesting if you look at social media, if you analyze like positions of people. So we did, for example, studies on like how people tilt their head when they look at like if they pose for a picture. So most people would have a so-called left cheek bias. If you take a picture, like a selfie, for your Instagram or whatever social media you're using, the chances are very high you put your left cheek forward because research shows the left cheek in most people is more emotionally expressive when it comes to positive emotions, right? Which has to do with the right side of the brain being relevant for emotions. So people don't actually like go to the scientific literature, neuroscience, and read that and then consciously decide, I put my left cheek forward. No, they intuitively do that because they realize people on a like certain level react more positive to this. And you can quantify this, right? So if you look at like likes on pictures, people like left cheek forward pictures more.
Have you ever ran into somebody that was truly ambidextrous?
It's very, very rare. So there's a huge discussion on that topic, the ambidexterity. So what we tend to differentiate, if you really want to go into the details here, is there's left-handed people, there's right-handed people, there's mixed-handed people. So this means somebody who's using the left hand for certain activities, the right hand for other activities. And there's also two more categories. And this is like the ambidextrous. And ambidextrous is defined as somebody who's on like all tasks as good as a person who's right-handed with their dominant hand. So you would do, to measure ambidexterity, you would have people doing some sort of like timed dexterity tasks. So for example, they have to write the alphabet very fast and very accurately. They have to move like little wooden pegs on a wooden board with holes and like certain patterns very quickly and very accurately. They have like on a touch screen, they have like little dots and would have to make they have circles and would have to make little dots on that. And then you time this with your left hand and with your right hand. And then you just check whether there are people who, for all these domains of handedness, are really as good with the right hand and the left hand as a right-hander with their right hand. And this is very rare. So I would estimate the population average about 0.1%, so maybe one in 1,000 people or so. Most people who actually consider themselves ambidextrous, if you do like a rigorous scientific testing with them, they are actually more mixed-handed. There's also the opposite of ambidextrous. So people can also be as bad as a right-hander with their left hand with both hands. So you can actually have two left hands. But that's also quite rare, right? So you know, like some people are super clumsy and things like that. So this also exists, but it's also very rare.
God, is their life really tough then? Like they
Depends
just have
on your job, I think, right?
Yeah, I mean, you're not playing a piano. Yeah.
You shouldn't do like wood carving, I guess. I mean,
surgery, right?
Yeah, don't become a brain surgeon if you're ambisynestral. That's a thing.
That's pretty much all the questions that I got. Is there anything that you think that we missed or anything like that?
There was some question about animals, I think, in your list.
Oh, yeah. Like, is handedness in animals at all? Like,
yes.
Do we seem to be the only ones with a handedness, or are there other things throughout the animal kingdom?
No, there's definitely. So people used to think that handedness is sort of like a thing that's totally only existing in humans. But it's absolutely not the case. So we did a study where we looked in like handedness in pretty much all animals in which handedness has ever been investigated. And these are 172 animal species. You will not believe how many people wrote their PhD on handedness or pawedness, as you might call it, in cats or dogs. It's a quite a favorite topic at veterinary schools, I think. And what we found was basically that handedness by itself is quite common in the animal kingdom. So on average, there was more than 72% of animal species that showed signs for left and right-handedness. And the interesting thing is that typically for animals, left-handedness or left-pawedness or left-flipperedness or left whatever you might want to call it is more common than in humans. So left-handed cats are more common than left-handed humans, or left-pawed dogs are more common than left-handed humans. So it is common that animals show it, but they tend to have a more equal distribution of right and left-handedness than humans do.
Thanks for checking out this episode of Profoundly Pointless. From society and sexuality to science and sports, every week we explore something new from a side of life you may never have heard of. Subscribe if you're interested. There's a playlist, I think, on the right if you want to see more videos like this. Someday I'm going to finish painting that wall, and just for the record, I'm not orange. I just don't know how to fix this. But thanks for checking out the show. Would love to hear from you. Okay, I should stop. Stop. There it is.